All right, first rule of this channel, we not talk about this channel. Second rule of this channel, this is not legal advice. So this is going to be a video on Jonathon Brooks and hype trains. Originally I was trying to break down camp battles, and then I noticed that the Panthers, the rookies reported, and I was expecting Jonathon Brooks to go on the pup. So when I was going to break down the video, I was like, hey, they didn't put Jonathon Brooks on the pup. I got done with the video, and it turns out they put Jonathon Brooks on the pup, and that's why I want to talk about, because it went from me having to change my draft strategy because Jonathon Brooks wasn't going to be on the pup to changing it back because Jonathon Brooks is going to be on the pup. In this case, generally talking about like roster construction, this would be my 13th spot. Like if you're in certain leagues, again, your league settings and my league settings may be a little bit different. In my high stakes leagues and in my high school league, there's a total of 13 spots, not counting your kicker and your defense. So in this case, like the guy at the bottom of my bench, like normally is reserved for the guy that I'm going to be, most happy to kick free, with that next waiver wire ad. In this case, if I go after Jonathon Brooks, I'm expecting him to miss like 4 to 6 weeks right now. If he starts the season on the pup, he may not do that. That's when we're going to start talking a little bit about hype trains here in a second. But with Jonathon Brooks, like I'm expecting him to be ramped up like they did with Brees last year. And you see with Brees coming off like an ACL, he goes 31% snaps in week 1. And then he's basically up to full speed right around like week 6. I think that's when they came out. Like week 5 or week 6 is when they came out and they said, hey, we're going to ramp up our Brees has the snap count taken off. He's full go. That's what I'm generally looking at with Jonathon Brooks. So as long as Jonathon Brooks' draft capital stays outside of like those top 5 rounds, and remember, those top 5 rounds have about like a 50-50 hit success rate. And then after that, like round 6 and on, they're the same round as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to let my hair down. I'm going to go after my targets because I don't want them to be on someone else's roster. And that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit today. So as long as Jonathon Brooks is going to go at the right price, then I'm going to pull the trigger on that guy. This news with Jonathon Brooks, it also tells me that if I want, I have a shake and bake RB2 to start the season, as long as the news stays that like Jonathon Brooks is either going to stay on the pup or he's get a bit like ramped up as the season begins. So I got a few weeks of Chuba Hubbard if I want them, and he's going outside draftability. Now, because of this, because equal and opposite reaction, Chuba Hubbard, he's going like 138 now on the ECR on Fantasy Pros. So like they already fixed him, and they said like, well, he's gonna have 4 to 6 type of weeks that are going to be able to give you like a 40-degree day with a chance to win you that week. So like that's just generally how I look at Chuba. And not that I plan on doing this, but I always know that there's a possibility that I can walk out of a draft with only like 3 running backs if I'm going to go with a guy like Jonathon Brooks. And that's because I know I am drafting a guy that's going to miss time. That's fine with me. He's got the upside to theoretically like win a league or be at least a high enough RB2 for it to matter. In this case, like I generally have kind of changed my strategy towards going after like ugly RB2s. And I only want guys that have the road to do the 2 things that I want, which is red zone opportunity and design passing work. And Jonathon Brooks is going to have design passing work. Like that's one of the things that like made him so interesting coming out of the draft. Like he can do that. There is let's say vacated opportunities with the Panthers this year for a guy to be heavily involved in the passing game. They need to figure out like targets for Bryce Young. And that's why there's a little bit of interest there. Normally, I don't like bad offenses, but hey, the Panthers can't be any worse than they were last year. So in general, this would change my strategy. Now, some of the comments that I've had about like my strategy and what all the colors are and how that strategy works. This is just a template. I probably won't finish this for my lazy kill manager until like, the week before our draft. I just do this before I go live. It's really easy for me to mark it up on the internet. So in this case, like to kind of explain what's going on with this, if say I had the 101 in my draft as a 10-team league, I'm gonna just draft whoever I want with the 101. Like you do Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Bijan, CeeDee Lamb, they're all the same guy to me. You pick the guy that you want, run your own league. In this case, the next pick that comes up, which would be like the 210, I would be expecting that like Travis Etienne and Rachaad White, those are going to be guys that I can tell the story that are going to be like elite or legendary running backs. I would be interested in drafting those 2 guys in those 2 spots because I'm expecting them to be available based off the rankings if this is an ESPN league. Now, I would love Garrett Wilson or Jamar Chase to fall to me at those 2 picks. I don't think that's going to happen. So like I'm not going to stress about those guys like magically falling. If those guys fall to me, like Travis Etienne and Rachaad White, like who are those guys? Those guys don't exist to me. Now, there's going to be two other guys that I would talk about in this range, and that's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. and Drake London, because I would be expecting those guys to be going right around like the late teens, the early 20s anyway, and I would have to think about those in my leagues relative to Travis Etienne and Rachaad White. They're my wide receiver 9 and wide receiver 10, so that's where they should be at in this ESPN league. If I like them enough anyway, I would have to go up and spend on those picks like the 210 and the 301. That's where I have to be pulling the trigger. So you kind of get an idea that like maybe I get lucky and one of those guys falls to me. I know who the two guys are likely to be there. And then, if this is an ESPN league, this is when I'm going to have to pull the trigger on Marvin Harrison and Drake London if I think they're worth it. And generally, I probably would end up going with like Rachaad White and one of those wide receivers in this range if they're both available. That kind of breaks it down. So moving on to what would be like the 410 and the 501, there's no one in this range that I'd be interested. Yeah, if I'm in an ESPN league and Marvin Harrison Jr. or Drake London follow me here, like I'm not overthinking it. I'm just going to take those guys because I think they're the wide receiver 10 and wide receiver 9 respectively, but I'm not expecting them to be there. That means the next guy that I would be looking at would be Mark Andrews. So I would be going up to like the 410 and pulling the trigger on Mark Andrews because he has the story to tell where he is a unicorn tight end, the number 1 and number 2 in his offense. I'm just not going to overthink that. I'm going to take the pick. Now, do I dislike Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes? No, but based off my draft strategy, I can get those guys someplace else. So I'm probably not going to overthink that. And maybe there's someone that I would want to stop and take a look at. If you're into Malik Neighbors, I'm going to talk about here in a second. Maybe I would think about that. Probably would not be too interested in the quarterbacks because I could get those later. And I would just generally look at some of the other guys. I do like Chris Godwin. Maybe I would pull the trigger on push Chris Godwin, go up and get him. Some of the other guys are out there like Calvin Ridley. The problem that I would talk about with this guy from a roster construction standpoint is I can only have so many non-league winners on my roster and have a chance to win my league. So like those ugly wide receiver 2s, those grow on trees, wide receiver 3s, those running back 2s, those ugly running back 2s, like I don't know how many of those guys that I want to go after. And when we talk about like Jonathon Brooks down here, I already know that I'm going to have a roster spot that I'm planning to burn for the first 4 to 6 weeks of my season. And if I'm wrong on some of these guys, and I don't have the ability to pivot, like I want to be careful about that in the first place. So again, in this range, like knowing the guy that I'm going after, what I'm expecting to get out of him, and I'm going to throw like Devontae Smith under the bus again and say like I know I'm getting a wide receiver 2. Like that's what I'm expecting to get. I'm not expecting to get anything else. If I go after like a Calvin Ridley, I know I'm getting like a guy that's going to be very volatile. He could theoretically win me a league. He could be a guy that I'm throwing away. And I generally don't like risking stuff on my top 5 picks. It's just generally not the way I like to go. So like, I don't know, even in this case, depending on the league, if I'm staring at these picks like this, I might have to decide like if I like Anthony Richardson enough, I'm going to go up and get Anthony Richardson because as you see with like the 610 and the 701, I would have to hope that like Anthony Richardson and Trey McBride fall to me at that plate. So there's a possibility with this pick, like the 610, the 701, that I would be stacking or not stacking. I would be putting Mark Andrews together with like a Trey McBride and doing like some sort of like bully tight end or something like that, and then getting Anthony Richardson at that point in the draft if he falls to me. But there's a couple other guys I do like. I do like Ramondre Stevenson, and there's my Jonathon Brooks target. So more than likely at the 610 and the 701 in this ESPN league, like I would be looking at pulling the trigger on both Jonathon Brooks and Dalton Kincaid. So unless maybe Trey McBride falls to me, and I would not be expecting him to follow me, that would be the only guy I would like really be looking at. But since I really like Dalton Kincaid, like I probably would even be going up on Dalton Kincaid. So those two picks are probably going to end up being like Jonathon Brooks and Dalton Kincaid because I do like Dalton Kincaid a little bit better than I like Trey McBride, if this makes any sense to anybody out there. So now that I know that I have these guys, I just go down the line. When the 810 comes up and the 901, I can just look at my targets and the guys that are available. So maybe in this range, like the 901, like I might go with another wide receiver. We'll talk a little about like Jackson Smith-Njigba down the line, but also like, is this where I would feel comfortable enough to go get a Ladd McConkey? Because I really liked Ladd McConkey. Because you see with the 1010 and the 1101, like maybe I could be a little bit risky and let those guys fall in this ESPN league and go like, I'll just overdraft them at this point. Maybe I could do that. I also have to know that like there's going to be other guys that are going to be targeting those. That's where it like comes down to like what my league is. My high school league, I may not do that with Lad McConkey because there's Chargers fans in there. Jane Daniels, like I probably would feel comfortable if he's in that like 11-10 range in that league that I know generally just follows best available. That's how I break it down. And then at the end of my draft, like I already know that I'm going to have a difficulty getting some of these guys off my roster because of the Jonathon Brooks pick in this league. Jonathon Brooks on Fantasy Pros right now, he's still at like 101 overall. So like again, this would change my draft strategy based off if I was following like a Fantasy Pros ECR league versus an ESPN league in this case. So like the guys I would be interested in, and we're going to talk about Chase Brown here in a second. I want to be wrong on Chase Brown in a way that like if Zach Moss is there, like this RB2, this like Joe Mixon clone, if he's there, I'm already know I'm likely not going to get him because of the other targets that are in this range. So unless Zach Moss falls to me like at the 8-10, like I'm just generally not going to be overwhelmingly interested in him versus going after like Chase Brown. Because if I'm wrong on Chase Brown, like I can get rid of Chase Brown and move on to somebody else week one. If I get like an ugly RB2 and Zach Moss, because I'm right, I don't know if I can get him off my roster. And there's only so many guys I'm going to be able to get off my roster late. So like I do like Chase Brown. I do like Blake Corum. Those might end up being my last two picks. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later because I don't know if I'm going to be able to carry Jalen Polt in my auction league. And auction works a little bit different because like I'm generally going to like price cap guys. And if I can't get them at those prices, I'm going to move on and go after the next guy. So in my auction draft league with Marvin Harrison, Drake London, I'll probably set the price at about like $25. And if I get them both, great. If I can't get either of them, then that's fine. I can pivot on other guys. I sent an email to my co-manager in that league and said like the best allocation of capital last year came from wide receiver 7 to wide receiver 10. So we're generally going to be looking at those guys in the draft and trying to get them severely under market value because those guys in the draft, they went under what they were going at last year. So in this case, like I might set the price on those and see if I can get like a Justin Jefferson for like $37. That would be how I would be going in that league if you're wondering about that. So in this case, like Jalen Polk, I might not be able to take, even though I really like him because I can tell the story was going to be a number one in an offense. And this is where the business decisions come in. And when we start talking about camp hype, no news is good news. And unless a coach is going to come out and tell me like, hey, I'm going to give this guy 70-80% snaps. He's going to get red zone usage and, design passing work. Like it just probably doesn't matter. Like I don't care how many guys go up, do one-handed catches. I don't really care about that. The other thing to talk about this, and I'll bring this up with like Jonathon Brooks, like this is good news to me because it keeps his value low. And I want guys' value to be low because like if they get too high, if the hype frame starts building on these guys, like I can't get them. And that's why I have like Calvin Ridley. So I set a price cap last year in my auction league, and I got Calvin Ridley at the right price. In my high school league, he went like 4th round pick, and I was like, nope, that's just way too risky for me. And, I didn't really get burned in my auction league because of the price that he went out. And I'll just say, like, no one has ever, complained that they lost the league because they busted on a 7th round draft pick, right? They may have picked the wrong guy in that range, but they never like lost the league because they went out and they got the wrong like 6th or 7th round draft pick. Like guys will complain that they lost the league because they busted on their 3rd round draft pick. And that's generally what we look at. So like with Calvin Ridley last year, the logic behind it, hey, that was great. We could talk about like Allen Robinson in 2022 also, but with Calvin Ridley, he's going to a team that desperately needed a number one wide receiver with, what we could say is like, a good enough quarterback in a situation that they were going to throw the football a lot, and it just becomes an issue of capital. So once they really start getting into that like 5th round range, like I'm not going to chase the hype train. That guy can't return at that point relative to the other guys that are out there. And that's why I bring up like these tight ends, with Calvin Ridley, what he did last year, which was, where's it at? 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. If Mark Andrews or Trey McBride or Dalton Kincaid does that's a win for me, right? Even to run that guy as a second tight end in a flex spot. If I get that out of a wide receiver, like that's replaceable. So even when Calvin Ridley finishes like wide receiver 17 last year, like that doesn't matter. That was because a whole bunch of other guys busted out. And that's not considering that like you had like Rashee Rice that got better as the season went on, or you had like George Pickens just like going off in the semifinal. Like this doesn't necessarily matter when we look at like what wide receiver 17 is. Again, it has more to do with points per game and those guys hitting the right weeks than anything else. So again, like wide receiver 17, like, hey, I spent wide receiver 17 prices on Calvin Ridley, I didn't actually get wide receiver 17, right? That's just the way to look at it. Like I got a boom bust like wide receiver 3 at that point, and those guys tend to grow on threes. So I don't like chasing after those guys. So when I look at like a Jackson Smith to Jigma, the camp news that's coming out of this guy, and I've heard this on like a couple sites at this point, the new coaching staff for the Seattle is like, hey, we want to basically build the passing game around Jackson Smith. Now, what does that mean to me? Well, probably nothing, because it's going to be very difficult for Jackson Smith and Jigma, even if he gets like 150 targets, to be that guy, because DK Metcalf can win games by not actually catching the football, by clearing it out for guys like Jackson Smith and Jigma. If I hit on Jackson Smith where he's going like 93 on ESPN. I think he's going like relatively like the same range, like 98 overall. Even if I hit on a guy like that and he gives me like, solid wide receiver 2 numbers, the question becomes like, how close does that guy get me to win me a league versus some of the other guys that are out there? And that's why I say, like, when I start building my strategy to look at these guys, like I know I got Ladd McConkey. That's a guy I'm going to probably get in all my leagues, because I'm going to go up and I'm going to get him. And I do like Jaden Daniels. That's going to give me like 2 shots at like an elite quarterback, legendary running back. And we'll talk about some of the guys that have the road to legendary running back as the offseason goes on, but also like those other wide receivers, the difference between like, that 12 to 14 point a game wide receiver and that like 15 to 17 point wide receiver, or even theoretically, and that's why I like Ladd McConkey, he's going to step right in and have the ability to be a number 1 attached to Justin Herbert. So last year when we look at like Calvin Ridley and chasing after Calvin Ridley as he gets up into like, and I saw with Calvin Ridley, he was going in the late second of snob leagues. So again, probably where he should have been going is right around like 5th round of the draft. That's where the business decision has to come in when you look at a guy like that. Because like, he could win me a league. He probably can't lose me a league in the 5th round. Once he goes after that, like, yeah, I'm getting in the range where like he could lose me a league after that, and I can probably replace that production someplace else if I'm savvy. So to moving on to some of the other camp issues that I would be listening about, like I already talked about this with Chase Brown. They're not going to come out and tell us how they're going to use these guys. So Zach Moss, if you're chasing last year's Joe Mixon production, wide running back 5, that's fine. I understand that. He's not probably going to get design passing work, so that's going to make him imperfect. It just becomes an issue at price. Do I really need an RB2 at that range of the draft? And then I'd be looking at that in general. I think he's right about like 86 on Fantasy Pros, so he's a little bit better. Zach Moss, like, I'm not uninterested in him. It just becomes an issue like who I'm passing up. And in this ESPN league, I'm probably not going to get him because there are guys that I'm interested in that area. In a Fantasy Pros league, when I'm looking at like Zach Moss to theoretically be a running back 2 for me with a little bit of upside, like he's not a bad pick. Like I would be looking at like, well, who would I be going up on in this league? Or like, who would I be pulling the trigger at him if he falls to me at cost at that pick? That's just what I'd be looking at with him. But, even if I hit on him and it's this ugly RB2, like what do I do with him later? We'll talk about like trades and some of that stuff. I don't like planning for trades like in the draft, what the value of a guy is. That's why in general, like I would probably like to be wrong on Chase Brown, so I have the flexibility week 1 of my waiver wire, because if I'm right on Chase Brown and I have this year's Kyren Williams, well, I already have the guy that I would have used it with his roster spot anyway. So that's just generally how I look at this stuff. So like no news when it comes to the Bengals, like I'm going after Chase Brown. If I get the right news, and again, like they come out and they literally say like, hey, Zach Moss is going to be the bell cow. Yeah, I'm probably going to change my mind on Zach Moss, because I do want that bell cow attached to that Bengals offense at this point in the draft. All right. Moving on. So a guy like Troy Franklin, I did hear some other guys talk about Troy Franklin. I don't care. The best story that I can really tell with Troy Franklin, and there's a long shot with Troy Franklin where he could end up being like the number 1 when it comes to that Broncos offense. And again, that Broncos offense is probably going to be somewhere in like the not good to not bad range. Like that's what we can kind of guess on with Sean Payton and Bo Nix. More than likely, what I'd be expecting with like Troy Franklin is maybe he can beat out Josh Reynolds for like the wide receiver 2. And at that point, like with Jackson Smith and Jigma, like there are other guys out there that I'm like, okay, like I get a wide receiver 2. I probably don't want to be drafting him. There's guys that I specifically don't want to draft because I want to see what happens week 1. And Troy Franklin, he's not even one of those guys. So I don't even care about that. Like, I just don't see the road where he gets me there. But I am aware that there is a Troy Franklin. In this case, it becomes an issue like Jolyn Polk. I can tell the story right now from camp hype that maybe he ends up being the number 1 to start the season. Now, it could end up being Javon Baker on this one. And right now I'm a little torn. Like, can I even not draft these guys? that's where it bothers me a little bit more. In my high school league, that's a 12-man league. I probably will end up getting Jalen Polk from a numbers game standpoint. In my auction league, I may not. And that's fine with me. And Javon Baker may be a guy that I want to listen to week 1, find out what the snap share is. The camp news, the camp battle with Javon Baker, we may find out that he doesn't even win the number 2 job. It doesn't even matter at that point. Like we're going to find that out. That's stuff that I would be listening to if they're just like, no, he's not going to start the season, then I don't need to draft him. Jalen Polk, from the news that's coming out there, like, yeah, he's probably going to win the number 1 job there. So now I'm going to get a little bit dicier about like, the business decision to let Jalen Polk fall. And again, that's going to be heavily based off builds. And since like I know I'm going to go after Jonathon Brooks, I'm going to have a limited amount of spots for wide receivers. I don't know. Like this is going to come down to the wire because I know I'm going to go after my lad McConkey because I know right now there's a vacated number 1 attached to Justin Herbert, and there's a lot of vacated targets there. So like I can tell that story with lad McConkey. That's why I like him as opposed to Jalen Polk. Jalen Polk, like maybe it's Drake May. It's probably going to be Jacoby Brissett. That's the difference. Like, they're both probably not going to be super high volume passing offenses. The difference is like, hey, I think Justin Herbert's a little bit good at football. That's just, the logic behind that. Now, guys like Brian Thomas right now, unless I hear the hype with Brian Thomas, I don't think that he's a guy that I can draft. Like, I don't think I can trust him. Like maybe I get this wide receiver 3, unless I get like the guy that I think is actually the number 1 attached to Justin Herbert or excuse me, Trevor Lawrence. That's what I'm not going to pull the trigger on Brian Thomas. If I draft Brian Thomas, I know I have to hold on to him for like 4 to 6 weeks, just like Jonathon Brooks. I have to wait and watch snap shares. And there's going to be a lot of guys in a lot of leagues that are not going to have the patience to do that. And I would rather have the roster flexibility to go other ways. Now, again, with that camp hype, I got to be aware of what's going to go on with Brian Thomas because that hype train takes off. I'm going to have to make that business decision at that point. And, usually the rule of thumb for me when it comes to hype trains is go the other direction. And that's why I say, like, if everybody starts moving Zach Moss up, and that's why I talk about this, he's moved up from, I think he was in the 90s. So now on ESPN, he's over here at like 76 overall. That tells me right now, go the other direction. Go for Chase Brown, because Chase Brown can't hurt me in a way that the higher pick ends up hurting me. And since I'm not going to go up on a Zach Moss, I'm not going to go up to pick 66 to get him. Like, I just don't see how I end up getting a Zach Moss, even though, yeah, like I could tell the story where like it's a good pick. And to finish this off with Malik Neighbors, when we talk about this and camp hype, what we hear coming out of all this stuff, like he's already really, what's the word? Like steamed up, I guess that's what I've been hearing other people say. Like he's already going at 49 overall on ESPN. And then on Fantasy Pros, last time I think he looked, he was like 57 overall. Where's he at? Somewhere around here, 50 overall. So Malik Neighbors is going 50 overall. So remember, if I want him, it depends on where my draft position is. So to go out and get a Malik Neighbors, I'm gonna have to jump. If I have the 101, I'm gonna have to jump all the way up to the 501 to go up and get, the 501 to go up and get Malik Neighbors. I'm gonna have to go with like pick 41 overall to make sure I get Malik Neighbors. At that point, if he busts, I got this really ugly RB3 on my bench, and I'm trying to like beg someone else to take him off my roster at that point. As opposed to Brian Thomas Jr., who I know when I pull the trigger on him, like I'm waiting 4 to 6 weeks to find out. Or with Malik Neighbors, I can know week 1 that offense isn't good. And then what do I do with a Malik Neighbors when I'm pulling the trigger at 49 overall? So like some of these picks I want to be wrong with. I know I'm buying a guy to be wrong with. Some of these picks, like I need to be right on that pick. And with Jonathon Brooks, like he's going at the right range where I could be wrong with that pick. As opposed to some of these other guys, like I just generally wouldn't want to do that to my build to start off things. So that's why I would feel really comfortable going like bully tight end and rolling a second guy in that slot as long as it's a unicorn or projected unicorn, I should say. So moving on to some of the other guys, like this is the camp stuff we would be looking at. Like generally the Giants are projected to be bad. That's why I was talking about Malik Neighbors. Devin Singletary, probably not very dynamic. I do like him. I do like the situation. I do like the value. I don't know how he wins me a league. It's probably going to be very similar to what Joe Mixon did last year. Probably not going to have as many touchdowns with Devin Singletary. So the camp news on these guys, it ends up being like, if I hear enough to make me think that like Eric Gray or Tyrone Chasey is going to be the starting running back there. Tyrone Chasey, yeah, I could definitely see maybe a little bit of design passing work when it comes to him. Like he's a converted wide receiver, and Eric Gray is a little bit better athlete than Devin Singletary. So in general, like outside of those particular builds where I need like an RB2 to start the season off, I'm not looking at Devin Singletary because there's other guys in that range. And to get an idea with like ESPN where he's going right here at like 101, like yeah, that's where I'm already looking to target like a Lad McConkey or Jaden Daniels. So I'm not interested in them. And then it's just become an issue of like, do I hear enough about Tyrone Tracy or Eric Gray that I have to draft them, or is it a business decision to find out week 1 on waiver wires based off of what I hear in camp? And other guys are talking about, like, again, generally speaking, beat writers, those guys don't exist as much anymore because of like just the internet and how print media is going away. So like this is sometimes like more super fans, and that's why like I listen to the same stuff you guys do out there. I just tend to go like I draw different conclusions than they do. That's what I said last year. So in general, like, if everybody's telling me to zig, like with Calvin Ridley, I will go the other direction because at that point, like that hype train is going to push him outside of whatever value the guy has to be able to return on that. So the other guys like Gus Edwards, my problem with Gus Edwards, and I do think that there is a possibility of this like outlier, like 800-yard rushing season, like 15 touchdowns. That may be there with Gus Edwards. Again, the two things that I want are red zone usage. He might get that in what would be a good offense. Don't know how much design passing work he's going to get, and that's going to lower his overall floor. So, or ceiling, I should say. In this case with Gus Edwards, where he's gone like 114 overall on ESPN, again, Chase Brown's going to be in that range of guys that I'd be maybe looking at to going and getting, or Blake Corum, something like that. So in this case, like the two things that I'm looking for in camp are going to be to find out like J.K. Cobbins gets cut. They only gave him like $50,000 guaranteed. So like if he stays on the roster, something's cooking. And the other thing that I'd be listening to is like 6th-round pick Kamani Vidal, who I do think can be used in the design passing game when he takes over this job. So again, is this going to be a guy that I have to have week 1 on my roster, or is this a guy that I can wait a week and find out week 1 what the snap share is? That's going to tell me a lot, because some of these guys, like, remember from a fantasy perspective, I want them on my roster the week before everybody tells me to go get them. And I want them in my lineup the week that they spike. And that's what I'm generally looking at when we look at numbers. And right now, like some of these guys, I want to see what they do week 1 to see if it's even worth keeping them on my roster a little bit early. And that's why I actually didn't bring the guy up. So I'm going to talk here. I'll just jump ahead real quick and talk about like Jaleel McLaughlin. And there's a reason why I don't want to hear any camp news about the Broncos when it comes to this. And the other guy would be like Alvin Kamara, because there's enough of a similarity to the Broncos offense this year with the Saints offense back in 2017 when Alvin Kamara was a rookie. There's a lot of running backs there. There was in 2017 you had Adrian Peterson all day, and you had Mark Ingram, and then you had Alvin Kamara. So this is when I like started realizing that like I didn't quite get fantasy football. Remember, opportunity is the king, the queen's efficiency. Alvin Kamara is the king of efficiency. So in this case, with Jaleel McLaughlin, those 3 other running backs that are there, you're looking at like Javonte Williams, Audric Estime, the rookie, and that I really like, and also Samaje Perine. So they may cut Perine. I could also see the 6th-round draft kit with Estime. They cut him. He probably would wind up someplace else if they did do that. So Jaleel McLaughlin's the one non-banger. So when I look at this Alvin Kamara season, again, red zone opportunity, design passing work, why I'm not interested in a Troy Franklin, why I'm a little bit more interested in Jaleel McLaughlin is if I can get like 100 targets for Jaleel McLaughlin, now he gets really interesting. And if I get the right carries when it comes to Jaleel McLaughlin, he becomes a red zone guy. I got Alvin Kamara. So is it worth it for me to put him on my roster week 1? Or do I need to make the business decision that like I'm going to find out week 1 when it comes to waiver and usage? And these are the things that I would be listening to when it comes to the hype trains and the camp news that are coming out with these guys, because I can tell that story where like Jaleel McLaughlin ends up being a little bit more interesting than even like a Zach Moss if I got to go up and spend like 66 overall. So to finish this off with the rookies, I'm not totally interested in Trey Benson and Marshawn Lloyd. Probably takes a little bit of the value when it comes to James Conner. And again, if you're drafting James Conner, I don't know exactly how you're trying to win leagues. Josh Jacobs, I can at least tell that story. I would probably be priority handcuffing Marshawn Lloyd to Josh Jacobs because of the draft capital that I put in with Josh Jacobs. I may not have to do that with James Conner. They both do have like league winning lottery tickets attached to them. I have some doubts about whether or not they would be trusted to be the full guy if the veteran goes down. Remember, they have to be able to pass block, and they have other pass blockers there. Like you have AJ Dillon, you have Michael Carter, Amari DiMercado. If these guys go down, so it just doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the good stuff if these guys are there. So like I do have like Ray Davis that I was listening to the bootleg guys talk about Ray Davis. He got drafted because of pass blocking rep. So right now with a Ray Davis, like he's an RB2, like flat out. Like this is why I don't necessarily get interested in some of these guys. Like I have to make the business decision on whether or not I want to go out and get Ray Davis, and I'm listening for a particular camp hype because if he's going to be that guy, that's going to lower James Cook. I can just take James Cook off my board, and now it just gets really interesting. Like, do I want this ugly RB2, or am I going to wait week 1 to find out? So, like some of these RB2s, I can just take off my board because I know that there's other guys that I'm expecting to be that guy, like a Ray Davis or a Blake Corum. And again, like Blake Corum, like he does have that league winning upside more than likely if Kyron Williams goes down. Probably not as sexy a pick as there are going to be other guys out there late in the draft. So again, these are going to be like the guys like, do I take a Ray Davis and a Blake Corum, or do I put like a Jolyn Polk in my cart at the last pick of my draft? Like something along those guys. A Dontavian Wicks would be another guy that I would be wanting to listen to from a camp status standpoint. Like unless the Packers come out when it comes to like Dontavian Wicks and flat out tell us that like, oh yeah, he's going to be like 80% snaps and he's going to be the red zone guy. Like maybe I want to take the business decision and find out week 1 instead of waste that roster spot. Cause I generally think more than likely what's going to happen with the Packers is they don't care about fantasy football and they're going to roll 5 wide receivers and 2 tight ends and 2 running backs. And it may be just a sloppy fantasy football mess. But listening to this hype train on this one, like if he goes up just because everybody goes like, I want this guy, I'm going to go the other direction and just stay away from him. If I hear that there's specific news that like, maybe he's the guy and everybody in the Packers land, like Jackson Smith and the Jigba they're doing right now with him. Like, hey, maybe he's the guy. Maybe he's the guy. I got to think about that. Like maybe he's worth spending that 8th, 9th, 10th round draft pick to be wrong on because I can get rid of him if he's just wide receiver 3. That's generally some of the stuff that's going to go on. So, rule of thumb, hype train, go the other way, get on a different train. Like that's just not a good way to win my league. And I got to start building my draft strategy based off of like, knowing what I'm drafting from a guy. Like, is this guy a risky pick that I can move on from? If I miss on him, like, am I going to be holding on to him for a certain amount of the season, like a Jonathon Brooks, like he's going to be right now? Is this a guy that's like 1 week and done? Chase Brown, he doesn't get the snap share, he doesn't get the uses, he's gone. Like that guy has more value to me than going after a Zach Moss and getting like this 50-50 split with like some of the gravy, not enough red zone, and definitely no passing work. Like these are the stuff that I start looking at, and I'm trying to parse this out. Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, they didn't get paid. Like that makes it a little bit easier with these guys. Like $4 million a year, Zach Moss. Gus Bus got like 3.75. Devin Singletary at like 5.5. Like Devin Singletary may have the best chance to just keep that job. So unless I hear the right stuff with these guys, like they're not draftable, I can find out later on. Maybe in deeper leagues, like my 12-man league, like maybe I gotta like make some of the decisions on some of these guys late. But that's how I hit Nico last year, just going like, hey, that's how I find that guy. So anyway, that's the general idea when I talk about like Jonathon Brooks and hype trains.